really gotta stop trying to give every mental health diagnosis a makeover. Hey, I'm Zanny. I make content about cats, crafts, and reveal the truths about mental health that most people don't want to talk about. And today I want to talk about the problems that arise when counter-stigma culture goes too far. I mean, counter-stigma starts out well-intentioned. Stigma is a problem because it stereotypes, overgeneralizes, and doesn't actually see a person or reality for what it is, which is not to say that it comes from nowhere, right? Most stigmas about mental health conditions come from at least one real experience, whether it's full reality or someone's perception of another person. So it's not that there's nothing accurate about stigma in any situations, but that it paints everyone with the same brush. I talk a lot about borderline personality disorder. And while I have developed some language for talking about different levels of recovery, there is no standard right now. So you could have two people who have, quote unquote, borderline personality disorder. One person has never been in treatment, doesn't have any awareness of themselves, and so they're acting out their problem behaviors on a regular basis. And you can have somebody who has the skills to manage their disorder. Unless you were very, very close to them, you would not even know that there was something different about them. But both of these people have BPD. Stigma treats them both the same. Or we have two people who have BPD. Maybe they're both untreated. Neither of them have done any work. Neither of them are particularly self-aware. But the way in which their disorder presents is very different. Stigma paints them both the same. In all of these instances, that's a problem. Because if we're not actually seeing someone for their actual real struggle, we have no hope of helping them get better. If you've had a bad experience with someone with BPD or some other mental health condition, totally makes sense that you would be cautious about new people with that same label. And certainly, not everyone is equipped to help someone struggling with a mental health condition. This idea that everyone should just be good at supporting us is insane because it's very hard to do that, okay? So just to put that out there. But when people perpetuate these ideas that everyone with a certain diagnosis is a particular way or does a certain problem behavior, especially when those are not actually part of the diagnostic criteria, it makes it harder to see reality. We don't really know what we're dealing with. And everyone with a particular diagnosis is treated as though they are all, one cookie cutter. And one of the things that I have learned in my life that I believe is true is that if you want to change something, if you want to make it better, you have to actually understand what it is. Call me crazy, but I think you actually have to know what you're dealing with in order to fix it. And if you just slap a label on someone and go, well, because of this label, you have all of these things, obviously, and you're not actually treating them like an individual, you can't help them get better. Stigma makes that worse. Counter-stigma does the same thing. Extreme counter-stigma does the same thing. What happens is this, right? Stigma is a very black or white way of looking at someone in a negative way. But extreme counter-stigma tries to fight this by doing the exact thing in the opposite direction. I mean, I cannot tell you the number of times I have seen people with certain diagnoses try to rebrand it so they can avoid getting lumped in with a particular kind of stigma. And look, if you are one of those people, no shade, I'm not shaming you. I completely understand the motivation behind it, right? If you've been on the receiving end of stigma, those situations objectively suck. And it makes sense that you would try to come up with some way to balance the scales. And the reason I'm making this video is to let you know that unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. And usually what happens is it makes the situation worse. And so to be clear, when I'm talking about, counter stigma, I'm talking about when people try to romanticize their diagnosis. One of the things I hear a lot is, well, I don't really hurt other people. I just hurt myself. I'm going to hold your hand when I say this. As social creatures, if you're hurting yourself, you are hurting other people. It doesn't work like that. You don't exist in a vacuum where you can treat yourself like garbage and it has zero effect on other people. And I didn't really understand that until I was on the outside of one of my friends who was very severely mentally ill and physically ill as a result of her mental illness. She wasn't mean to me, but when she treated herself and her body like crap, that absolutely had an effect on me and all of her other friends and family. we say these kinds of things to make us feel better and to distance ourselves from stigma. But if those things are not true, they are just as unhelpful and damaging as stigma. Because again, if you don't see yourself as you are, if you're not willing to look at reality as it is, you don't have a way of hoping to change it. You know, what's deceptive about counter-stigma culture is that it convinces you that you're evening the scales by, you know, here's a negative outlook, so I'm going to rebrand it as a positive thing, and that's going to even it out. What I've observed happens in situations like that is actually it makes stigma worse because it increases polarization between people. Let's just follow this through its logical outplay, right? Someone has a negative experience with someone, since we're on the BPD train, we'll say BPD. Someone's had a negative experience with someone with BPD, and they erroneously conclude that everyone with BPD is like this person. And so they go online and they say that everyone with BPD is this way. Then they see someone with BPD trying to rebrand their disorder as something softer, fluffier, more palatable. They're not going to sit there and think, oh, wow, maybe I was wrong. They're going to think, wow, that is proof right there that none of y'all can take responsibility for yourselves. You have to change everything. So just proves my point. It just proves my point. So people without the disorder feel invalidated. Because when we try to rebrand really distressing, destructive disorders as these romantic, tragic issues, it makes the people who have actually been on the receiving end of our problematic behaviors feel completely invalidated. So they double down. But then what happens? We feel invalidated because they're perpetuating their stigma, and we double down. And it just keeps going back and forth and back and forth. And people who feed into the stigma just get more and more aggressive. But then we get further and further away from really being honest with ourselves and really sitting with what's actually happening, because the stigma is so extreme that we feel like we have to do something to even it out. It doesn't work like that. It just doesn't work. I mean, you can see this in politics, right? Like, people being more extreme doesn't balance anything out. It just makes people more extreme. That's all it does. So counter-stigma culture, when it's used as a way to try to balance out stigma, just increases polarization. So like one post in particular that really bothered me was, this was like 2017, but it's circulated around a bunch. Somebody said, you know, I have borderline personality disorder, so I'm not toxic or manipulative or attention seeking. I have a personality disorder. I'm not trying to destroy your life. This is just how I am because of my disorder. Essentially, it's trying to rebrand all these problem behaviors as being part of the disorder. So the implication is, so it's okay? And I get a similar ick when people try to rebrand things like manipulation or attention seeking, because while I understand that our intentions and behavior don't always match, I think it's really invalidating to anyone who's been on the receiving end of manipulative behavior to tell them, oh, I wasn't being manipulative, I was connection seeking. Like, that's the kind of thing I probably would have said in the past because I didn't want to be labeled manipulative. And now that I'm kind of on the other side of it, I see how wackadoodle that is. Like, I don't think the solution to stigma is let's just rename everything, because I think that's just going to make people less likely to want to listen to us, because it just we look tone deaf when we do that. And this brings me to one of my other points, which is that counter-stigma often confuses the truth, right? Like there's a difference between stigma and something being uncomfortable and true, right? Like manipulation has this connotation of conscious malicious intent, especially if you're on the receiving end of the word. It's like, well, I wasn't trying to be that way, so why would you say this? But when I look up the definition of manipulate, it's to manage or influence skillfully, especially in an unfair manner. There's nothing about intent in there. It's really about the unfair, skillful management. You can have skills and not be aware that you have them, right? Implicit learning is a real thing. Actually, a lot of the behaviors that we engage in, whether you have a disorder or not, are things we learned implicitly. A lot of manipulative behavior isn't somebody sitting there thinking, how can I get you to do what I want? It's years and years and years and years of this person trying, like when they were young, trying out behaviors, getting a particular result, and their subconscious going, great, that did what we wanted it to do. We're going to do that again. Just because you're not aware of it doesn't mean it isn't happening. And just because it's uncomfortable to hear somebody call that out doesn't mean it isn't true. Of course, there's a lot of nuance to this, right? Like, so before you come at me, just because somebody says it about you doesn't make it true either, right? Like somebody could be directing stigma at you, and that's why this is messy and difficult. But I think we have to be really careful in our quest to try to connect with people and reduce stigma, that we're not just telling them that their experiences mean nothing because it's hard for us to hear about it. Sorry, I'm getting sassy. It just really, really bothers me because it's not just problematic because it's invalidating to the other people, but if you yourself are not able to look at yourself and go, yeah, the way I behaved was kind of unfair, like maybe there was a kernel of truth in my motivation, maybe my goal was to try to connect with someone, right? Like people would call me manipulative sometimes because when I felt slighted, I would react really big because, and now reflecting back, I think my subconscious rationale was, if I get you to feel the same emotional pain that I feel right now, then you will learn not to keep treating me this way. But really all that did was like I scared people into not confronting me about things that bothered them. I would call that a manipulative behavior, but I didn't want to accept that because, well, I wasn't trying to do that. I was trying to get you to understand me. So the problem with that is, if I'm not honest with myself about how my behavior is affecting other people, how am I supposed to improve it? If I just try to tell people, well, I'm not manipulative, I'm connection seeking, that doesn't really put the onus on me for the problematic way I'm trying to reach out to people. Like something can be manipulative and connection seeking at the same time. And I think rather than try to rebrand everything to something that sounds nicer, that we have the messy, difficult conversations that we need to have where we ask, like, what do you mean when you say that? What does it mean to you when you hear that? Because I'm not going to get anywhere by invalidating all the people who've been on the receiving end of my problem behavior. That's just going to push them further away from me. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that you can't have a conversation with someone and be like, oh, you felt manipulated? Wow, that was really not my intention. Those conversations are important. What I'm talking about are these generalized posts that try to wrap up a disorder or problematic behavior in a really pretty bow so that you don't have to feel bad by being associated with that word. And yeah, problem with stigma is paints everyone with the same brush. If you don't actually engage in that behavior, you don't deserve to be painted with that brush. But if you do, if the shoe fits, the shoe fits. Okay, there's a difference between stigma and being confronted with your actual problem behavior that you just don't like being called out. Another example of problematic counter-stigma culture is over-attribution to trauma. It's not that trauma isn't a legitimate part of a lot of these diagnoses. And I absolutely recognize that processing past trauma can be a really important part of the healing process for a lot of people. There does come a point at which there is such a focus on trauma that it really comes across as, well, it's because of my trauma that I'm like this, so blame the thing that traumatized me, don't blame me. Like I saw a post that was like, well, people with BPD just weren't loved enough. And that really bugged me because what does that even mean? No, really, like what does that mean? What does that mean to not love someone enough? It's so unbelievably subjective. And I say that because love is an emotion and it's an action. And I would say that true mature love is having a strong emotional attachment to someone and also treating them well. But number one, you can treat someone very well and it might not be what was the best fit for that person. You can love someone and it's a mismatch of the type of love and the other person doesn't feel loved, even though maybe you love them, to someone else, it would be amazing. Like you legitimately didn't do anything problematic. Or, there's those of us with BPD know this very well. You can totally have a very strong emotional attachment to someone, but not be able to treat them the way that they should be. And so really vague, fluffy things like that don't really mean something concrete, or they don't mean the same thing to everyone, not helpful. Because it ends up coming across like, well, I wasn't loved enough, so blame my parents for why I am this way. That's not to say that there aren't situations where parents do an irreparable amount of damage. They do. And there's definitely a time for grieving that. But you can't reduce your entire disorder down to that. I mean, for one, none of us get to relive our lives over again. We don't actually know how we would turn out in the absence of certain traumatic experiences. I didn't have any childhood trauma. I had an idyllic childhood. It was great. My parents were amazing. And I still developed severe BPD. And if I look back, it wasn't some big trauma moment. It wasn't even a lot of little trauma moments. It was a lot of different experiences taught me certain maladaptive beliefs about the world. And I architectured myself around those maladaptive beliefs, and through operant conditioning, turned out the way that I did. Most of the trauma I experienced was as a result of having BPD. It was not the cause. And I'm not special. There are a lot of other people out there like me. So I'm the first to tell you that just if you hadn't experienced that trauma, there's no guarantee you wouldn't have had BPD or whatever else. You can't guarantee that. Did it contribute to the way in which you express whatever? Sure. Is it possible that you wouldn't have had it without that experience? Also true. You just don't know. That's the big thing. Number one, you really don't know. Like, a lot of the things that we think about why certain things come to be are speculative at best. It would be unethical to put a bunch of kids in deeply traumatic situations on purpose to see what would happen to them. But that's the only way that we could really definitively prove anything about the cause and effect of these things. The leading understanding of etiology for a lot of mental health conditions, but BPD in particular, is that it's a mix of things. It's a mix of your environmental experiences, traumatic and not, and some of your heritable traits. You interacted with your environment in just the right way that things turned out the way they did. And when we reduce things to trauma to this extent, it's not helpful because it's not entirely true, and it keeps you stuck in the past. At a certain point, you have to be like, look, this is what happened, and I've done all the grieving and processing I can, and now I'm going to move forwards. Even when we are traumatized, that doesn't absolve us of the responsibility for our behavior. And this over-focus on trauma, it really reads like I'm going to stay stuck in the past so that I have an excuse to not work on my present. And that's how I see it play out. And again, this is one of those things that requires a lot of nuance, because yes, trauma processing is important. I am not saying that it's not. But there does come a point at which a lot of people use trauma as an excuse to stay stuck. I've done it. Just because I didn't experience trauma to cause my BPD does not mean that I didn't experience it later. I've been violated in some pretty serious ways that caused a lot of difficulties in my relationships. And it was important for me to recognize what had happened, that I had gone through trauma, and that was why I was behaving the way that I was. But that understanding only got me so far. And I can't really think of a situation in which it would be okay to tell somebody, well, I was traumatized, so that's why I behave this way, with the implication, therefore you have to accept it. It's one thing to explain a behavior and why it's challenging so that people can have compassion for you while you are working on it, versus using it as an out. Problematic counter-stigma also sounds like, oh, I'm not mentally ill, I'm just complicated. All these things that try to make serious conditions sound like quirky and fun. These are disorders. If I put a crown on my cat, it doesn't make her the Queen of England. I mean, she's always a queen in my heart, but like dressing things up to sound better doesn't actually make them better. It just makes everybody more confused because nobody knows what we're talking about anymore. The solution to all of this is, instead of trying to constantly rebrand everything, we work more towards taking the judgment out of some of these words and be willing to have the messy conversations with people. Like, what do you mean when you say this word? What do you receive when you hear this word? We're all so busy trying to dictate how we're allowed to talk about things that we end up avoiding having actual conversation. This is a sticky and difficult topic because there is gray area. And that's why all these conversations are important. How are you supposed to understand an individual's experience or anything about what anyone's gone through or how they interpret what you say or how you interpret what they say unless you actually talk about it? The solution isn't that we need to make disorders look prettier. We just need to be honest with ourselves and other people about what's actually going on. Sorry, this got a little ranty, but it just really bothers me whenever I see content like this because it's so unhelpful. You can't strip the nuance away from something and have it still have value. And honestly, I think a lot of the rebranding is just another way to avoid healing. If you can say that it's because of stigma that you're not doing better and you spend all your time rebranding your disorder, then you don't actually have to spend any time working on it. And again, nuance, right? The effects of stigma are real. Marsha Linehan herself said that people with BPD shouldn't tell their medical doctors that they have it because they'll be dismissed. I've had that experience myself, right? Like, I'm not saying that the effect of stigma isn't real and that we don't need to care about it, but I don't think that the answer is to rebrand everything. I think we need to be honest about what's really going on, and we need to remind everyone that disorders are not monoliths. We're not all the same. And also validate their experiences. Gosh, I mean, the BPD community talks so often about how we want to be validated. You don't think other people on the outside want the same thing? Maybe if we validated other people's bad experiences, they'd be more willing to listen to our experiences. If somebody comes to me and says, well, my ex-girlfriend did it and it was horrible, it's not helpful if I say, well, you shouldn't say that because I wasn't like that. It's way more helpful if I say, wow, I'm so sorry that happened to you. Maybe I did used to be that way and I learned to be better. So, I'm sorry it didn't work out, but there is hope for her or them that they change. There are so many other more helpful conversations we can have than telling people that they shouldn't share their negative experiences because stigma, right? And to be fair, I think a lot of the words that are stigmatizing, like manipulative or attention seeking, are not particularly helpful because they also, like I wasn't loved enough. They also don't communicate something solid. We all have different interpretations of what that means. But this is where the observe describe skills from DBT, where you try to really see what's going on and describe what you see clearly. So instead of saying, oh, well, you're being manipulative, you say to somebody, you said this and it felt like an underhanded attempt to get me to do this. It's not useful to us to just try to come up with better words. We just need to have better conversations. So do it. Have better conversations. I am committed to having better conversations. I hope you will join me in that. So hopefully that was not too convoluted. And if there is anything that didn't totally make sense, please feel free to leave a comment or question down below. I am happy to engage anyone in respectful dialogue, even when they disagree with me. This is the beauty of the interwebs and being human, is that we can have difficult conversations. So let's have them. And I'll see you next time.